You're starting to hear Bitcoin actually be framed as the most ESG asset.
Yeah.
There's a report from KPMG that basically talked about the virtues through an ESG lens. From the Eve perspective, they brought up like Bitcoin being able to reduce methane flaring, for instance. From the S standpoint, it's better for financial inclusion. It has cheaper, international payments than traditional payment methods. Or the G, it's a new form of governance, decentralized, resistant to manipulation and corruption. And so you're starting to see that framing. Do you think as a community we should just reject that completely? Or do you think maybe we should lean into that just to get people to support Bitcoin, even though we know ESG is kind of baloney? Do you think it might be like a Trojan horse kind of situation where at least they'll get to think about Bitcoin in a positive light?
I mean, I hate these kinds of things. It's just, no, and I don't think they work. And
Yeah.
I mean, in this case, what I would say is insofar as, so ESG is a package of a bunch of stuff, mostly BS, but insofar as there's anything legitimate in it, don't call it ESG, but you can think about it. So for example, with the issue of flaring, there's an issue of, in large part, because we don't build enough infrastructure because of the green movement, we
Mhm.
have what's called stranded gas, particularly when you drill for oil in certain places. There's what's called associated gas. So there's natural gas that you can't make use of. And so you do what's called flaring it, which is burning it for safety reasons, because this gas could otherwise explode and kill people. So flaring is a good thing. It's not an evil thing, because you're doing it as part of getting energy that improves human life. But all things being equal, you'd rather make use of the energy. So it's true that Bitcoin, you can set up Bitcoin mining with these kinds of remote things. That, by the way, that argument totally depends, though, on people valuing Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, because otherwise what you're doing is you're still burning the energy and generating CO2. You're generating Bitcoin value from it. But if you don't think Bitcoin is valuable, it doesn't help. And in any case, this is not, quote, saving the planet from CO2. This is not decarbonizing the planet to use Bitcoin in this way. So I think of it as it's a value prop. Like, talk about it as a value proposition. Think in terms of, I've coined the term not ESG but LVC, like long-term value creation. So talk about that. You can also talk about environmental quality stuff. And if, and to the extent Bitcoin, well, we can talk about the details, but if and to the extent Bitcoin can actually help make, say, something like solar and wind more valuable forms of energy, that's good. But it should be in terms of, hey, this is more valuable forms of energy, not Bitcoin is going to help us decarbonize. Bitcoin is not going to help us decarbonize because Bitcoin is a significant increase in energy use. Now, relative to everything we use energy for, it's not that big, but it is a significant use of energy. It uses more than a lot of countries do. And that's totally fine. That should be embraced insofar as you think Bitcoin is valuable. But increasing the amount of energy used in the world is not decarbonizing the world in a world where fossil fuels are still uniquely cost effective for most purposes.
Let's talk about some of these narratives around Bitcoin mining. A lot of proponents of Bitcoin are really excited about it as a promising technology for the energy industry for a lot of different reasons. We already mentioned, methane flaring or utilizing stranded energy resources. But another one is stabilization of the grid. As like a flexible load, miners can turn on and off with the click of a button much more easily than other forms of energy, like say like a hospital, to kind of give energy back to the grid when they need it, and then they kind of turn back on when there's low utilization. Do you think that narrative has legs, or do you think that maybe it's a little bit overblown? I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, it's just, I would just say in general, always worry about these opportunistic and convenient narratives and subject them to some scrutiny, and be aware in one's own thinking. Not you, because I don't think you're sympathetic to this, but just be aware when it seems a little bit too convenient for your own kind of short-term interest, in the sense of, oh, wouldn't it be great if all these, well, I'm calling them maniacs, but let's just say all these people who are against fossil fuels and sort of hostile to more energy use, they suddenly loved Bitcoin. Like, that would be convenient, and it suddenly helped their cause.
Yeah.
Like, okay, that would be convenient, but it doesn't really make any sense. So you think about, I mean, what are you actually talking about here with the grid? So you're saying I'm going to buy this incredibly expensive Bitcoin mining equipment, and I'm going to choose to operate it not based on ideal market conditions for profiting off Bitcoin. I'm going to do it based on demand on the grid. So if there's prime time for me to mine Bitcoin, I'm not going to do it because I'm going to lay off right now, and I'm just going to let this capital investment that I've made, that which by the way depletes in value all the time because there's always new superior technologies. I'm just going to let that sit idle huge amounts of time so that I can quote unquote help the grid.
Hmm.
Like, is this
In terms of the
really
ASIC machines, that's what
what's
you mean?
that?
In terms of the ASIC machines, that's what you mean?
I
Like
just mean
letting them
all the
sit idle?
mining equipment. I mean, this is all just
Yeah.
based on computation.
Yeah.
Computation is improving all the time. So you make these, you're basically, I mean, when you're buying something, you're basically renting it for its useful life. You can just think of that. So you're saying, I'm going to buy this very expensive equipment and I'm not going to use it a huge amount of the time, including time when it'd be very valuable, because I'm trying to help solar and wind on the grid. Like, this just is one should be very skeptical of this kind of thing. And it's often going to depend on subsidies and this, but it just doesn't make any like, in general, unreliable energy is not very valuable. And this is just the thing. And why should it be? And why should we be so obsessed as a society with how do we adjust ourselves to the weather? That's this obsession, right? How do we adjust Bitcoin to the weather? How do we adjust industry to the weather? Like, this is just a ridiculous, like, we need to adjust the weather. That was the life that we used to live, right? Where we just are the victims of the weather and we're at the mercy of the weather. Like, what the electricity grid created, starting with coal, is the ability to match uncontrollable demand with highly controllable supply. That's the achievement of the grid. And now we're regressing to the point where we're focusing on, okay, how do we not demand when we actually want something, but we demand it when the weather is compliant? And so I think Bitcoin trying to fit itself into this is very weak. That's different from the stranded case where you can say, well, we can get this product uniquely cheaply. And we really do have a kind of unique offering because we can engage in computation in this one isolated location. And then, of course, you're interacting with the rest of the world, but it's like you don't need nearly as much infrastructure interact with the rest of the world digitally as you do in terms of having a pipeline or having a long distance transmission line to handle the electricity. So the stranded case makes a lot more sense than this other case. Are there cases where this thing might work? Maybe. But in general, what people are going to do is they're going to find really cheap ways of producing energy that are controllable, that are 24/7, and they're going to use that to optimize Bitcoin mining. And that includes things like using coal in places where it's cheap to use coal.
Mhm.
And you should not be against that. I mean,
Yeah, no, so like you're essentially saying, but there is this overcapacity of solar and wind. We're not going to change that, driven by this green movement. And that causes all these problems with the grid. And yeah, like Bitcoin's kind of benefiting from those problems by acting like a solution to them. When you say that, we shouldn't even be trying to fix that, like
well,
we should be
the question
focused on
is,
trying to fix the underlying problem of the um
well,
unreliable energy sources.
how much is this actually a thing that there's oversupply all of these different times? And again, just what are the economics of depending on these peaks? And like, if somebody, it's plausible that somebody can make some money doing this, but this is not going to be the way all Bitcoin works. Is that because you're just depending too much on the variability of the weather on these other kinds of things. You're also, by the way, if there's actually cheap like sort of solar peak induced electricity or wind peak induced electricity, you're going to have other people trying to compete for that as well, not
Mhm.
just not just Bitcoin. It's just like, usually, like, most factories, for example, like, why aren't most factories over the moon about this? Why aren't most factories going to say, we're going to shut down? We're going to shut down most of the time. But when there's excess solar, we're going to manufacture the shit out of things, because it's just not very convenient for their investments. It's not efficient to not run most of the time. The best times to operate are not the times when there happens to be the best solar. So it's just not going to be a thing that is it's not, this is not an idea that has been thought through from the perspective of what is the most efficient way to mine most Bitcoin. It's an idea that's been thought through from the perspective of how do we get the climate people not to hate us? And I think it has a bunch of obvious flaws to it. Now, in general, no, we should not be encouraging the government to mandate and subsidize more unreliable electricity on the grid and shut down more reliable capacity. That is a disaster that is happening right now. And you absolutely don't want Bitcoin to be part of that. And one of the actual dangers of Bitcoin is it's part of a movement of increasing demand for reliable electricity and decreasing supply of reliable electricity. And that's a way in which Bitcoin will actually be demonized. And if you guys support the unreliables and mandating them and preferring them, then you'll be part of it, because people are saying, wait a second, during this outage, people were mining Bitcoin and we didn't have enough electricity. And the point is, yeah, everyone has every right to mine Bitcoin anytime, but
Mhm.
you shouldn't be contributing to reducing the supply of electricity.
But if we, if you brought up the factory example, it would just be more costly for a factory to shut down its operations in response and then turn back on. Where the argument would be that Bitcoin miners are much more flexible and they kind of react, shut it down, shut it back off, and then they have power purchase agreements with the grid operators to get paid to do so. I don't know
Yeah,
if
well,
you're familiar with
that's
that.
part of the scam. It's made more valuable when you're getting paid, but that means other people are being ripped off. Uh,
Can you explain that
and
a little bit?
yeah, I mean, so in
Yeah.
general, I mean, the whole power purchase agreement. So in general, if you look at the cost, like what is the cost of solar or wind? The actual cost of solar or wind or any other kind of raw source of energy is the full cost necessary to transform it into reliable electricity. And with solar and wind, so it's not just the solar panels, it's not just the transmission lines, it's whatever the life support capacity is. Say the natural gas, the coal, the hydro, the nuclear, that's giving it 24/7 life support. So what's the cost of solar and wind in Texas when they both dip below 1% capacity during Winter Storm Uri, right? The cost of all of that backup slash life
Yeah.
support. So the grids do all sorts of things to not fully charge, to not fully make solar and wind pay for their full cost. And so what they do is they create all these different kinds of agreements that allow them to pretend that they're providing cheap electricity and make everyone else pick up the expense. And so part of that is they can make a power purchase agreement with somebody where somebody says, hey, I'm going to pay the grid and we're going to label you as green. So we're going to pretend that all the electricity you're using comes from solar and wind. And then we're going to blame all your actual coal and natural gas use for everyone else. So Apple does this all the time. Like, we're paying for the credit for this. We're paying for other people to take the blame.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of versions of this, but they almost always involve lying about who's actually using what kind of electricity, because everyone's just using an equal mix of everything at any given time.
Gotcha.
But they're also generally underpricing these things. So they're offering an artificially low price that then other people have to pay, in much the same way as I live in California and my neighbors who have solar panels are just totally ripping me off. So they'll just say, "Oh, well, I have a great agreement with the government to get really cheap solar," but that's just ripping me off because they're not paying the full cost of their electricity, and so I'm paying more than the full cost of my electricity. So there's just all these different scams involved in ignoring the fact that unreliable electricity adds cost to the grid. Now, my solution for this policy wise is simple. I think all the generators should be required to generate reliable electricity. And if they can do that, if they can combine solar and wind and batteries and gas and whatever, they should do that on their own. I don't think I think it's a lot simpler if every generating entity generates reliable electricity. This is what used to happen before we had solar and wind on the grid. And then if you can figure out a black box to do that, great. You can even use Bitcoin on your black box. I don't think it'll be that effective, but you can use it. But right now we allow them to sell unreliable electricity. We subsidize the hell out of it. We don't have a price penalty for the unreliability. And so part of what the Bitcoin is coming into with these power purchase agreements and other stuff is it's just part of looting the regular rate payers on the grid in the name of being green. So I just recommend don't be part of that. Don't pretend these fantasies are real. And again, there is huge vulnerability to being a major electricity user and participating in the degradation of the American grid.
Hmm. No, I mean, that's a very nuanced topic, and it's, thanks for sharing your thoughts. I mean, the stabilization of the grid. I
Oh,
mean,
but there's the factory thing. Let me just say the factory thing because you mentioned
yeah,
the factory thing. Well, it's harder for them to stop and start the factory. It somewhat depends on the kind of factory. You might say because they need to have more reliable delivery. That's another cost. But in a certain sense, a lot of factory equipment improves at a much slower rate than mining equipment. So the
mm,
cost of non-use is like the depreciation is not the same in terms of it as a slower depreciation.
because
So with
the chips
Bitcoin,
get updated and the efficiencies improve
right,
every
right.
couple
So
of
it's
years.
just like with any kind of computation. I don't know. I don't think Bitcoin's any different than any kind of computation. A huge amount of like it's constantly increasing. It's constantly increasing, which means the current equipment in a competitive environment, the current equipment has a very limited shelf life in terms of being cost effective. So if you're talking about we're going to keep it off for like 12 hours a day, including sometimes the prime time in terms of pricing, like that's not utilizing very expensive capital equipment that depreciates very quickly. That is not a good financial plan
Hmm.
for most people. So it just no, this is I just think this is there are a lot of obvious flaws with this idea and I don't think people are thinking them through because they're being opportunistic.